So a couple of weeks ago, we started looking into this chapter. We recapped on that cycle of sin and idolatry that was evident within the nation there, the oppression and the subjugation that went on. And then finally, in each cycle that went on, we see God steps in and he brings salvation. And his people, they get the judge, the deliverer that was necessary in each case to defeat the enemies that had come upon them. That was kind of the context of verses 1 to 10 that we looked through of that chapter. That cycle repeated itself time and again. We talked about that. We talked about how there was actually an improvement, just a cycle of 7 years this time before the judge was coming along. And this time it was at the hands of the Midianites, wasn't it? And we talked about those 7 years of destruction, but also those 7 years of hiding, those 7 years where they lost sight of who they were and who God was. But enough was enough, and God was about to act. That was verses 1 to 10. And as I was looking at these next set of verses, there was something that kept coming to my mind. And I thought it was kind of like an introduction that you see in a film, isn't it? That time just before the action of the film starts. And what do you see sometimes happens? You get a couple of minutes where they give you an overview, don't they? That you see this snapshot picture review of a situation that's evolved over time, and you might get a voiceover that comes with it, and then they're detailing out all of the things that have happened in this potted history before it comes to the main film. And then you just imagine the last verse being spoken over the images of the nation of Israel continuing in their sinful ways. And it details that out. It details out there was this godlessness that was in the nation. And then the picture fades to black. And as that dramatic music builds and they come to the part where the film starts, and the music just starts to fade away, there's a new scene that comes into focus. And you see a tree in the distance. That's where we hit verse 11. Because it's dramatic, verses 1 to 10. Let's be honest about it. We see so much detail in there that helps us understand what's gone on with the nation before we get introduced to Gideon. But here we have this new scene. The camera zooms in and there's this tree. And verse 11 carries on. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. So the verse starts by introducing the angel of the Lord, doesn't it? And we're just going to spend a little bit of time just to start with focusing on that. Because throughout Scripture, we see passages where people are receiving information from God. There's some sort of dialogue that goes on. There's a messenger that God has to deliver the information he wants. And that could be varied. That could be through one of the prophets that he has raised up to tell the people what his updates for them are, what his requirements are, what his expectation of them is. It could be prophets or angels, or in this case, the angel of the Lord. So it's possible that appearances of the angel of the Lord, as this one is a pre-incarnate manifestation of the Lord Jesus. That's a lot of lobbying for that is who it is. Whatever the case, whether it is that or whether it's an actual appearance of God the Father, it's highly likely that the phrase the angel of the Lord is referring to a physical manifestation of God himself. Predominantly here, generally thought of to be the pre-incarnate Jesus there. So as the verse carries on, it tells us the angel of the Lord sat under the terebinth tree. I'm not sure if you know this, but if you do, let's just remind you. Because I don't know, I look around and maybe you are all tree experts. It's quite possible, I don't know. The terebinth tree symbolizes something. It symbolizes power and strength. Some Bible versions refer to it not as a terebinth tree, but an oak tree. Now, if you look into some kind of biblical kind of historical documents, they talk about there is a distinct difference between a terebinth tree and an oak tree, but they fundamentally came from the same word, which means a mighty or a strong tree. And I guess you could say that the inference is when we start building into what's going on in Gideon's life, were a strong or a mighty man, however farcical that might seem as we introduce him in these first few verses. So here we have the angel of the Lord sitting here. I don't think it's too much of a stretch of our imagination. Just imagine he's sitting there and he's watching, and he's looking off into the distance at the winepress where Gideon is. He knows who's inside. He's getting set for the conversation that he's about to have. Once we're given some information about Gideon's heritage, we're not going to concentrate on that tonight because there's something a bit more pressing that I think is more important to cover off. And that's what he's doing. Gideon's in the winepress. And what does it say he's doing? He's threshing wheat. And that's interesting because that's a breakaway from the norm. Because the norm is that it's done in a large, flat, open space, typically done outside, called the threshing floor, on what they normally do it on. And that's the key. It would normally be outside. But that's not what we see here. That's not where Gideon is in place. Because he's in the winepress, and he's tucked away in there. And it's probably cramped. And why is he tucked away in there? Because he's hiding. He's hiding from the Midianites as he's doing this because he wants to protect that which he's working on. Wants to keep what he's working on to himself and his family and whoever else it's going to be useful. It's funny, isn't it? Because Gideon is described as one of the heroes of faith in Hebrews in chapter 11. Doesn't look anything like that right now, does he? As he's cowering away in the winepress. Maybe doing it in a manner that just doesn't show the characteristics of what this angel is about to come and describe him as. That's what makes it all the more crazier what is then said in verse 12. It says, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. And think about what you know about the Bible. You know, however far your understanding stretches from the front to the back cover. Is there any other passage that you can imagine which seems the most obvious overstatement of reality? At least on the surface, if nothing else. Because that's what we have here. You know, is that statement irony? Is that statement just something that doesn't really reflect the man that stands before this angel of the Lord? Is it that the angel of the Lord sees something in Gideon that he isn't himself aware of? You could say that's a possibility. There's a lot been spoken on this. And there's a lot of other credible answers that comes up. But there's something that does seem quite feasible in the angel telling him that he is a mighty man of valor. Let's think about it in this respect. Consider it in the light of what we know is written in Philippians 4 verse 13, because that verse says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So if we take a verse like that, and let's think about that for us now as a believer. When we're saved by God, we are strong. When we are strong in and through Jesus, that's a power that's come from God. It's a strength that's come from God. He provides that, not us. That strength isn't in us at all. What do we know from that? We are fully reliant on him for all of the strength that's needed to overcome every single daily battle that we may face, whether that may be physical, spiritual, mental, whatever that may be. God can provide that which is needed. Does that not sound very much like the same principle that you could apply here to Gideon? He's not a mighty man of valor. He could be. He could be if we think about what's written in the next few verses and we follow that through and we see God working in that situation and through that man. You know, for Gideon himself, he's thinking these are crazy words. And it's going to take him time to see that which the angel of the Lord says is in him. That's a bit like us, is it not? We sometimes have no expectation that we have anything to provide. We give nothing back as of ourselves into other people's lives. We're something to one side. We're not confident in ourselves. We can't speak. We can't help. We can't do X, Y, or Z. But you know what? We could do amazing things when we do it all through the power that Jesus gives us. Verse 13 carries on. It says, Gideon said to him, "O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites." Gideon's gone on to say some really stupid things here. There's 4 things specifically that he outlines in that little bit of rhetoric. And let's just think about them briefly. Number 1, he comes in and he hits the ground running with a statement of stupidity. Because what does he say? He says, if the Lord is with us. Why is that stupid? It's stupid because why on earth say if? Because what do we know? The angel of the Lord has just come and just told him that the Lord was with them. And he counters by saying, well, if the Lord is with him. Second thing, Gideon then asks, why then has all this happened to us? I mean, he's blinkered, he's blind, he would be. If it wasn't obvious enough. Just remember what verses 7 and 8 said last time. And it came to pass when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord because of the Midianites, that the Lord sent a prophet to the children of Israel who said to them, because of the Midianites. Why do we know the Midianites were there? Because they took, as in the Israelites, took their eyes off of God. They lost sight of who he was and who they were as his people. And they fell into idolatry. And the result of that was the oppression that the Midianites put on them. Remember, God had promised that very judgment to them. If you want to read a whole heap of detail about that, go after this service and go and read Deuteronomy 28. That details out the exact position they found themselves in. It should have come as no surprise. They should have seen that they were responsible for that. There's a whole heap of detail there. Third thing, Gideon asks, where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about? Pretty embarrassing disconnect from reality that he has here. Because Gideon, he deflects the blame, doesn't he? Deflects the blame from his own shoulders, from others' shoulders. Because what are they? That they are effectively those people that are mentioned back in Judges 2 after Joshua's death. That generation that forgot about God. He's a part of that generation. The angel of the Lord was standing right in front of him, and he was still doubting. There's still one thing, finally. Gideon, he brings this kind of ill-informed and ignorant rant to a close, and he says this, the Lord has forsaken us, and nothing could be further from the truth. Because what do we see in this passage? Because Gideon, you know, that disconnection that he has to God, that inability to see that he was a part of a situation that had created the whole the situation that they were in, that God had created this covenant with his people. All of these truths, all of these facts, all of these things that were 100% cast iron and concrete, so many people have forgotten about. And they had become obsessed with the terror and the destruction that the Midianites were putting upon them. And in the middle of all of that, Gideon stands up and he's like, God's forgotten about us. But it wasn't the case. If anything, it's the complete opposite, because he's there and he's watching and he's waiting What does he want? He wants their obedience. He wants them to see the error of their ways and to cry out to him. And that's what happens. And it's happened in the past. That's the cycle of the judges that they've gone through. And it's happening here again. Back in last session in verse 7, it says to us, Israel cried out. And there was no delay. You can imagine Israel cries out and God's, they've remembered me. And he responds. Now we see in that verse, in verse 13 there, what do we see? Excuse after excuse. We've been left alone, he says. What have we done? I don't understand it. Why are we where we are right now? It's not our fault. And to top all of that, where is God? If we're his people, why has he abandoned us? And it was just one thing after the other. But the blame lay squarely at his door. The blame lay squarely at every single person's door who had just pushed God to one side. Gideon didn't see it. What could you say from that? Gideon was neither a mighty warrior, nor was he a man of faith. There were so many questions in his mind. You could say there's a just reason for frustration in God, but hearing this, knowing that this man who is going to become the one that would take them out of oppression is just so full of doubt, so full of questions. But that's not the way that God thinks. That's not the way that God works. Because what does he do? He carries on this recruitment drive for his new judge, his new deliverer. And he pushes on. Verse 14 says, Then the Lord turned to him and said, Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? So he said to him, O my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And the Lord said to him, Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man. It's clear Gideon doesn't feel like a mighty warrior. And as for saving Israel, it kind of like pushes him over the edge, doesn't it? This is too much for me to process. And he feels more like a weakling than a warrior or someone who is full of valor. That's the Gideon that's standing before the angel of the Lord right now. And maybe you could say that those excuses just carry on rolling off of his tongue. Maybe you could say he's looking for some reassurance. Could be either of those things. Because what does he basically says this? I come from the weakest clan. And in fact, not only from the weakest clan, but I am the weakest of the weakest family in the weakest clan. It's like you've literally dragged the dredge the bottom of the riverbed to find me. I'm about as bad as you're going to get. He has no trust. He has no faith. In his mind, God's got the wrong man. Just imagine and contrast that for a second to a man like David. Someone that we know who was basically the polar opposite to what Gideon expresses himself here. Because what do we know? David, he had no right to go up against Goliath. In terms of the stats, his end was going to come fast. It was a cast iron guarantee he would be defeated, but his willingness and his trust in the God that he served was the power that overcame Goliath, was the power that defended God's honor. There's some difference between those two men, those two mighty men of valor. But let's draw aside for a second. Have you ever felt like that? I know I've felt like that. Have you ever felt like that? Have you thought that you don't have anything to offer God? That you probably can't be used. You'd like to, but I just can't see how it fits into the big picture. Say, welcome to the Gideon Club, because that's where he was. Take the wonderful words that we read in Ephesians 2:8 and 9. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Overlay those words concerning salvation and put them onto the Gideon encounter with the angel of the Lord. And that's us as well. That's me and that's you. We're weak. That's fine. It's fine. Because we can be strong in God's power. What does he say to Gideon? You can save Israel. But you're not going to save Israel because of you. You're going to save Israel because I, God, have sent you. That's how you're going to save Israel. You're going to save Israel because I can save you. You're going to save Israel because I will be with you. In his chosen nation's most trying moments, God wasn't a distant God. He was a God there at the very forefront. He was a God in the midst of the battle with them. What does God say to Gideon? He says, the victory is going to be mine. It's not going to be yours. All of the plaudits, they'll be directed at me. They won't be directed at you. That's something for us all to bear in mind in our lives. We don't do the things from a gospel perspective for our own glory. It's all for God's glory, to draw other people to him. And then from verse 17 through to the end of our reading in 24, we read this again. Then he said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who talk to me. Do not depart from here, I pray, until I come to you and bring out my offering and set it before you. And he said, I will wait until you come back. So Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread from an ephah of flour. The meat he put in a basket, and he put the broth in a pot. And he brought them out to him under the terebinth tree and presented them. The angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread and lay them on this rock and pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. And the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. Now Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. So Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. Then the Lord said to him, peace be with you. Do not fear, you shall not die. So Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, the Lord is peace. To this day, it is still in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Think about it. God had responded to each and every single one of Gideon's objections. He'd given him an answer to all of them. He said all that was needed to bring him peace, to bring him that assurance that he needed to go through with the task that the angel of the Lord had given him, to give him that confidence that he needed, to give him the hope that he needed. His victory was assured. That should close off all of those concerns, shouldn't it? It should have been a joyous conversation from that point onwards. It should have been, okay, let's get to it. But it wasn't. Because Gideon turns around and he says, I need a sign. I need to know that it's you. I need you to show me. I've heard some words, but I need evidence. I need something hard and fast right in front of me right now. And Gideon says, I need to do something. I'm going to bring an offering. God agrees, saying that he'll wait until Gideon comes back. That almost seems farcical, doesn't it? That Gideon says, just hang on a second. I'm just going to go off and I'm just going to prepare something. If you just hang around for a bit, find a bit of shade, do whatever it is that you need to do. Isn't it amazing, the picture of God's patience here again? It kind of, in many ways, it reminds me of just kind of that battle that Moses had when God was calling him, and the lack of belief that he was the man for the job. It echoes a little bit what we see here in Gideon, doesn't it? It's an amazing way of ensuring that Gideon saw he had work to do for God. So Gideon goes and he returns with a sacrifice. And God causes that sacrifice to burn up. And at the point in time that it burns up, the angel of the Lord immediately disappears from sight. It causes Gideon to fear he's going to die because he knows he's been in the presence of the Lord. But God just responds in such a simple way, doesn't he, in verse 23? Peace be with you. Do not fear, you shall not die. God's plan and his work that he had for Gideon was so far from being completed. He was still building that man up to be able to be effective for what his work was for him. And what do we see as we close out those verses up to 24? That Gideon builds an altar in response to that exchange that he had with the angel of the Lord. You know, the verses, as we look from 11 through to 24, they show us God's calling upon Gideon. He was more than just a little bit reluctant to accept God's call, wasn't he? To start with, what was he? He questioned, he was afraid, he was a bit deflective. Every single thing that went on in that conversation was God saying, you can. And Gideon saying, I can't. And God worked through that process. The objections and the excuses brushed to one side. You know, God could quite rightly have rebuked Gideon for his lack of faith, for his inability to follow in the manner that he should have done. But God's not that sort of God. He doesn't respond in that way at all. You know, God knows Gideon. God knows you. God knows me. He knows every single thing about each one of us, far more than we'll ever know about ourselves. He knows that we're weak and that we're fearful at times. We might not admit it to anybody else. But thankfully, he does not expect perfection from us, because he's not going to find it, is he? What can we consider as we close this section of the chapter out tonight? Because the lesson and the challenge for us, however we look at it from this passage, and particularly if you're a fearful person, I don't know, is not to allow our fear, or in fact, build on top of that a catalogue of excuses that we might come up with. Not allow fear or excuse to prevent us being obedient to God. Because that's what he wants from us, doesn't he? He wants our obedience. And that's easy to say, I know. But God knows us. He takes us and he teaches us, doesn't he? And he does that step by step if we trust him. Psalm 37, which we read earlier, just verses 23 and 24, says to us, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delights in his way. Though he fall, he shall not be utterly cast down, for the Lord upholds him with his hand. You know, Gideon, being weak like us, was fearful, but he still obeyed God's command. He still obeyed. We do well to ask God how maybe we're not being obedient to him in our lives. Think about it. In writing to the Corinthian church, Paul knew where the power was in his relationship with God. In 2 Corinthians 12, second part of verse 7 and the first part of, right through to the first part of verse 9, he says this, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Our weakness should not be an excuse before God, because it's that moment when we are maybe at our lowest, our most defenseless, that God can use us in the most powerful way. That level of trust and obedience that he had, I pray that we all wish that God would put in us as well. You know, he'll often use the strife of Midian to bring people to the place of weakness where they become totally reliant upon him. We saw that through those first 10 verses. That strife caused them to cry back out to God, didn't it? You know, we can also learn something here about Gideon's blindness, can't we? Because he quickly looked to blame others than himself. You know, he looked to pass the blame over to the whole nation's disobedience. You know, he didn't even really look and say, well, hang on, my father, he was one of those that was being disobedient. He created one of the altars that they were worshipping to. We need to ensure that maybe we too are not people that look to blame those things that are going wrong in our lives. One, maybe on the sin in our lives, but equally two, the devil. Is that not a get out clause? Wow, the devil did, or I've been tempted this. We need to be careful that we just isolate it to that, because think about it, what we see happening here. And we mentioned this last time in John 16:33, in the world you will have tribulation. Because it might not be our sin. It might not even be the devil working. And it might be this. Scripture details something out for us. Sometimes it's so that God's glory will be revealed. John 9:1-3 says this, now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. That's something powerful for us to remember. We may have no understanding at all about why a situation is evolving. No understanding at all about a struggle that might be going on. And maybe we'll never know, other than that God might be glorified through it. Last thing, God's call upon Gideon's life was clear. Have any of you considered how God might be calling you out in some way in your life? You know, because God created each one of us unique. There's not a single thing about me that is the same about any one of you. And with that, he knew exactly what he was doing. With that, he gave every single one of us unique gifts and skills that can be used in service to him. Every single one of us. Things that can be used to bless others. He knew that there were things that needed to be done in this world that I can't do that you could do. That someone sitting on the right here can't do that someone sitting on the left can do. We all know what our Bibles tell us about. It's a body made up of many different parts. But when they come together, under the power of God, they can do amazing things. You know, maybe God's calling you today to live and be a witness of the truth, of the life that comes from living according to how God would have us live. And maybe God's calling you out tonight to be obedient and faithful and trust in every single situation and conversation you find yourselves in. Maybe God is staring down at you right now, and maybe you are in your wine press. Maybe you are right near that terebinth tree, and God is calling out to you, asking you to do something for him, to follow him faithfully in service to him.